Greetings, my friends. How are we doing today? Are we ready for a dose of sinister heathenry? But before we begin, if you like what you see, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe to this channel. Help me to get to 20,000 subscribers by the end of the year. I would greatly appreciate it. Thank you. Now, I'm the type of person who prefers an ugly truth to a convenient lie. But I've come to notice that most people aren't that way. This is one of the many reasons why we have a lack of equilibrium within the collective unconscious of the Western world. Ever since the Romans began to spread that philosophical and psychological taint called Christianity across Europe starting in the early 4th century, there's been a significant imbalance. The banishment of the old gods have brought about too much light and not enough darkness. But isn't that a good thing, you might ask? Don't we want a greater abundance of light? No, we don't, because it leads to a denial of half of who we are, that shadow self. And that shadow self is still being fed but not nurtured, which can be a problem. Let me give you an example of what I mean. What if you were to take a pit bull, keep it chained up in the dark, still feed it though, but the only attention you ever give it is negative? What do you think would happen if it got loose? That's the problem with the greater psyche of Western civilization. But you neo-pagans and modern Druids might be saying, we acknowledge the old gods and are trying to bring them back. And in return, I would say to you, no, you're not. Not in their totality. Because even though you think you're resurrecting the gods in truth, if you're not recognizing their dark half, you're still playing in the Christian sandbox. The scenes you're watching I've used in a few of my videos. They're from a TV series called Britannia, which is about the Roman invasion of Britain. Now, even with all its problems from a historical perspective, which I won't deny, I still found it entertaining. I liked it because of their depiction of the Druids, which they showed as dark and menacing, almost shamanic-like. Yeah, the first 2 seasons were entertaining, the third, not so much. This is because, besides the fact that the producers decided to make the once strong male leads weak beta males, they added in black Celts. I can deal with some historical inaccuracies, but this was going too far. Now, before some of you start yelling racist at your screen, understand this simple fact, this very simple fact. There were no black Celts. Some black Romans, maybe, and the show does depict that. Whether they were sub-Saharan Africans and in Britain is debatable. But black Celts, no. What this did was take me out of the show. I could no longer get lost in the narrative. This would be like if you were to watch a program about the Zulus and the great warrior king Shaka was played by Chris Hemsworth. I would have a problem with that, as everyone would or should. I think the reason why they did this is because season 3 was shot back in 2020 when the BLM riots were going on and the filmmakers allowed their white guilt to get the best of them. Anyway, one of Britain's top modern Druids stated back when Britannia debuted that the show's depiction of the Druids was an insult to the Celtic holy men and that it's fictitious nonsense and it vilifies our peace-loving forefathers. This bears no resemblance to modern-day Druidry nor the Druidry of the past. They were storytellers and a force for communal good, and there is no evidence human sacrifice was ever involved. It's ridiculous. It gives us modern Druids an even worse name. Fuck, there is so much wrong with this statement. This is what I was talking about when I stated that the modern pagans and Druids were still playing in the Christian sandbox. And this hippie prefers the convenient lie. He's still infected by Christian morality, even though he thinks he's let it go. Fucking peace-loving forefathers? The Celts had a culture of headhunting. And that's what the Celts were, a culture and not a race. And the most common way to spread a culture is, or was, by religious or spiritual means. And guess who the spiritual leaders of the Celts were? It was the Druids. That idea of good, bad, light, dark, righteousness, and sin had no place among the mythological makeup of the ancients of Europe. As I've said in other videos, the gods were like the weather, neither good nor bad. Rain can help make the crops grow, but a storm can decimate those same crops. He's right about one thing, though. It doesn't bear any resemblance to modern Druidry, which is obvious because modern Druidic philosophy isn't ancient in any way, but was created about 200 years ago. And human sacrifice? Did the Celts or Druids perform human sacrifice? Yes. And most who have studied history believe this because not only historical records, but also archaeological evidence points in that direction. Now, human sacrifice probably wasn't all that common and only conducted at times of great stress when communities were under threat, but the historical evidence is there. Remember, the Celts were not peace-loving tree huggers. They were headhunters. And material evidence suggests that Celtic sacrificial rites were undertaken in an organized manner, almost certainly done with the participation of their priests or holy men. And since the Druids were the holy men, they would have not only participated in sacrificial rites, but officiated over them. But what is your evidence for this, you hippies who pretend to be Druids may ask? Well, there are 3 kinds of data we can rely upon regarding Celtic human sacrifices. Number 1, the documented accounts of classical Greek and Roman writers. Number 2, medieval Irish and Welsh texts found in mythological tales. And number 3, the archaeological data, which is the most important evidence. I know you hippies are about to write in the comment section that we can't rely on what the Greeks and Romans wrote. They hated the Druids. To begin with, of course they produced anti-Celtic propaganda. The Romans especially, because they wanted to paint them as savages, thus justifying their conquests. But a great many of those classical writers who did write about the Druids did so with a mixture of awe, fear, disgust, and respect. They would write that the Druids were wise in the ways of nature, but would also bathe in the blood of human sacrificial victims as they called upon terrifying spirits from the dark underworld. Exaggeration? Sure, but we can't forget that the Celts were headhunters, and there tended to be blood if you're hunting heads. But you hippies may continue with, we know the warriors were bloodthirsty, but that doesn't mean the Druids were also. Well, looking at the historical accounts, for example, one written by Strabo, states that the Celts would strike a man who had been consecrated for sacrifice in the back with a sword, make prophecies based on his death spasms, but they would not sacrifice without the Druids being present. And there's more than just the writings of Strabo. There's also the accounts of Julius Caesar, who was in Celtic Gaul for 10 years leading the War of Roman Conquest. He knew this region personally rather than relying on secondhand information. While many ancient authors painted negative pictures of the Druids, condemning them as blood-soaked savages, Caesar respected them for their abilities as natural scientists, teachers, and healers, and also for their shamanic-like abilities to commune with the denizens of the underworld. And because Caesar wrote his chronicles knowing that they would be scrutinized by the Roman Senate, I doubt he would have written fanciful bullshit, because he would have been called out by his fellow officers who had been there on the campaign with him. In his accounts, Caesar wrote that the people of Gaul were completely devoted to religion, and for this reason, those who were greatly affected by diseases or danger from battle either sacrificed human victims or vowed to do so using the Druids as administrators of their sacrifices. It was written that the blood of criminals was the most pleasing to the immortal gods, but when the supply of bad guys ran out, they resorted to inflicting punishment on the innocent. Years later, in Britain, Tacitus wrote of the dark groves on the Isle of Anglesey in Wales, haunted by Druids and containing crude and sinister altars soaked with the blood of human sacrificial victims. Besides blood-soaked altars, other forms of human sacrifice have been documented as well, such as constructing huge anthropomorphic figures of straw and wood and throwing cattle, wild animals, and human beings into it before lighting it on fire. This idea of a wicker man not only came from the Roman writers, but references to a similar activity could also be found in both Welsh and Irish myths and legends. And now we come to some of the best archaeological evidence for human sacrifice. In August 1984, industrial peat cutting operations at Lindo Moss in Cheshire, England, revealed part of a human body. The police were called, but it turned out that the man wasn't a modern murder victim, but instead was killed about 2,000 years ago, and his placement in the swamp preserved not only his skeleton, but his skin, hair, and internal organs. He appeared to be in his mid-20s, and it's thought he was someone of high status because his fingernails and facial hair were neatly trimmed. Now, some might be thinking that if he were of high status and or of wealth, he may have been a mugging or kidnapping victim. But by all indications, this was a highly orchestrated ritual killing because it was too complex for him to simply be a victim of a crime. To begin with, he had been struck on the head, then garroted, and then his throat cut. And while still breathing, he had been pushed down face first into the marsh because of bog water found in his lungs. The manner of killing was conducted with such care that it intended to keep the victim hovering on the precipice of life and death for some time. So why, you may ask, do we think this may have something to do with the Druids? It was because of the fact it was ritualistic and evidence found in his gut. According to the Roman historian Pliny the Elder, the Druids regarded mistletoe as having great spiritual significance. And in those hours before his brutal death, Lindo Man had consumed a final meal that consisted of a strange mix of wild plants, cereal grains, and mistletoe pollen in such a large amount that it had to have been deliberately included. Now, there had been a Roman military presence in Britannia for about 10 to 15 years before the sacrifice of Lindo Man. During this period, the Romans were moving northwest across Britain to destroy the Druids' main power base, which Tacitus tells us was on Anglesey. Thus, the execution of Lindo Man might have been an aversion sacrifice designed to protect the island. And there appears to be other grisly examples substantiating this aversion hypothesis. In 2000, in a cave in England not far from Bristol, Skeletons belonging to numerous people and dating back to about the time of the Roman conquest were discovered. Mark Horton, an archaeologist at the University of Bristol, believed the pile of bodies suggests savage resistance to the Romans through deadly ritual. If it were a ritual, the Druids may have killed the victims, who show evidence of skull-crushing blows in a single event. And the Roman invasion itself may have escalated the Druids' ritualistic slaughter. Maybe the whole thing is a gigantic sacrifice, an appeasement to the gods in order that they will get ultimate victory against the Romans, Horton said. This was a highly structured deposit that can only have got there as a result of some form of ritual activity. This region was an important center for the underworld cults during the later Iron Age, some of which survived into the Roman period. And there are also numerous archaeological sites all throughout France that back up the fact that the Druids partook in blood-soaked rites. And besides that, and getting back to the written evidence, the truth is very little was documented about the Druids. Very little. So why is it you hippies believe those sections you like? For example, like the part that the Druids were learned nature lovers, men of the oak, while ignoring, from those very same written accounts, the blood-soaked rites. Think about it. So, in conclusion, I'm addressing you people of the modern world who call yourselves Druids. The real Druids, those of the past, were not peace-loving, nor were they your forefathers. They were something different, extremely different. They dealt with the savage reality of existence, while you viewed the world of the past from that safe perspective of one still enslaved by Christian morality. It's time to remove your rose-colored glasses, for the age of the Christ current is ending. The mask of civilization will fall, and if you then continue to abide by your naive philosophy, well, I wish you luck. Until next time.